Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name is James Jones and I am 68 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on July 14th, 2003, a date that's seared into my memory like a brand on cattle. I was a long-haul truck driver back then, rolling through the back roads of Idaho, delivering produce to a small-town grocery store chain. I'd been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, and I'd seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It started as a routine trip. I'd left Boise early in the morning with a trailer full of apples and potatoes. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as I pulled out of the depot. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and diesel fuel. I remember thinking it was going to be a good day. My destination was Grangeville, a small town tucked away in the mountains. The route was familiar, long stretches of highway with barely any other cars, winding through dense forests and past the occasional abandoned farmhouse. It was just me, the truck, and the open road. I had my thermos of coffee, my playlist of classic rock tunes, and enough beef jerky to last me through the apocalypse. Life was good. As I drove, I thought about my life, as I often did on these long hauls. My wife Sarah had passed away 5 years ago, and our kids were all grown up with families of their own. Trucking had become my way of coping, of staying busy and useful. There was something comforting about the monotony of the road, the steady hum of the engine, and the ever-changing landscape outside my window. The first few hours of the trip were uneventful. I passed through small towns with names like Horseshoe Bend and New Meadows, watching as the terrain gradually became more rugged and mountainous. The forests grew thicker, the road narrower. It was beautiful country, but isolated. The kind of place where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. About halfway through my trip, I pulled over at a rest stop near Cottonwood. I needed a break, and the truck needed fuel. The rest stop was deserted as usual, just a couple of vending machines and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a decade. I stretched my legs, grabbed a soda, and leaned against the truck, enjoying the quiet. The silence was almost eerie. No birds singing, no wind rustling through the trees, just the occasional creak of my truck as it cooled down. I found myself thinking about all the stories I'd heard over the years from other truckers. Tales of ghostly hitchhikers, mysterious lights in the sky, and creatures that shouldn't exist. I'd always laughed them off as tall tales, but standing there in that empty rest stop, those stories didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. As I was about to get back in the cab, I noticed a car parked a little way off, an old beat-up Chevy. It hadn't been there when I pulled in. I could see someone sitting inside, but they didn't move or acknowledge me. A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I shrugged it off and got back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. An hour later, the sun was setting and the road was getting darker. I was approaching a particularly isolated stretch when my CB radio crackled to life. It was unusual to get any chatter out here, so I turned up the volume, curious. "Breaker, breaker, anyone out there?" The voice was shaky, almost desperate. "Yeah, this is Bluebird, what's up?" I replied, using my handle. "Bluebird, this is Hitchhiker. I'm stranded out near mile marker 78. Can you give me a hand?" I hesitated. I didn't usually pick up hitchhikers or stranded motorists. It was too risky in this day and age, but something in the guy's voice made me think he really needed help. And mile marker 78 was just a few miles ahead. "All right, Hitchhiker, I'm close by. I'll be there in 10. "Thanks, Bluebird, I owe you one." As I approached mile marker 78, I saw the Chevy again, parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. It was the same car from the rest stop, I was sure of it. My gut told me to keep driving, but I couldn't bring myself to leave someone stranded out here in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over and climbed out of the cab, leaving the engine running. The driver's door of the Chevy opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and lanky, with a scruffy beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice matching the one I'd heard on the radio. "Car broke down and my phone's out of juice. Mind if I catch a ride to the next town?" "Sure, hop in," I said, still cautious but figuring I couldn't leave the guy out here. He climbed into the passenger seat and I pulled back onto the road. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the tires on the asphalt. I could feel the tension in the air, thick as fog. "You got a name?" I asked, trying to break the ice. "Call me Jack," he said, staring straight ahead. "All right, Jack. Where you headed?" "Anywhere but here," he muttered. That should have been my first warning, but I ignored it. As we drove, I noticed Jack kept glancing back at the road behind us like he was expecting someone to follow. It was making me uneasy. "You running from something?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just trying to get away, that's all," he replied, not offering any more details. The night grew darker and the road seemed to stretch on forever. I decided to pull over at a truck stop up ahead to grab a coffee and use the restroom. Jack stayed in the truck, saying he'd wait for me. Inside the truck stop, I grabbed my coffee and chatted with the clerk for a bit, trying to shake off the weird vibe from my passenger. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the linoleum floor. A few other truckers were scattered around, hunched over plates of greasy food or staring blankly at the small TV in the corner. I took my time, hoping that when I got back to the truck, Jack would be gone. But as I pushed open the door and stepped back into the night, I saw my rig right where I'd left it, looming in the darkness like a sleeping giant. When I got back to the truck, Jack was indeed gone. The passenger door was wide open and there was no sign of him. I looked around, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. I was about to call it in when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark stain on the passenger seat, still wet. It looked like blood. My heart started racing. What the hell had happened? Where was Jack and whose blood was that? I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. I decided to keep driving, thinking maybe Jack had just freaked out and taken off. But the longer I drove, the more I felt like something was very wrong. The darkness outside seemed to press in on all sides, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding something sinister. About 20 miles down the road, my headlights caught something up ahead. It was another truck, overturned and blocking most of the lane. I slowed down and pulled over to see if anyone needed help. As I approached the wreck, I saw two bodies lying on the ground, covered in blood. It looked like a brutal attack, not just a crash. My stomach turned, and I reached for my phone to call 911, but there was no signal out here. I was on my own, standing in the middle of nowhere with two dead bodies and a growing sense of dread. I heard a noise behind me and spun around, but there was nothing. Just a dark, empty road and the trees swaying in the wind. I hurried back to my truck, my mind racing. What the hell had happened here? And where was Jack? I got back in the cab and locked the doors again, my hands shaking. I decided to keep driving until I found a place with a signal to call for help. But as I drove, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see Jack or someone else lurking behind me. Then, just as I was starting to think I was losing it, I saw him. A figure standing by the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. It was Jack, covered in blood and holding something that glinted in the light. A knife. I swerved to avoid him and floored the gas pedal, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached a small diner on the outskirts of Grangeville. I ran inside, breathless and terrified, and told the staff to call the police. The cops arrived about 20 minutes later and I told them everything. The stranded car, the hitchhiker, the bloody truck, and the figure with the knife. They took my statement and went out to investigate, but I never found out what happened next. All I know is that Jack was gone, and so were the bodies from the wreck. I finished my delivery the next day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I took a few days off, trying to process what had happened. When I finally got back on the road, I avoided that route like the plague. Years have passed since that night, but it still haunts me. I often wonder who Jack really was and what he was running from. I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, looking for his next ride. And I wonder if I'll ever truly be able to put that night behind me. Sometimes late at night when I'm driving through lonely stretches of highway, I think I see him. A tall, lanky figure standing by the side of the road, thumb out, waiting for someone to stop. And in those moments I grip the steering wheel a little tighter, press down on the gas a little harder, and remind myself that some strangers are best left alone. In the weeks following that nightmarish encounter, I found myself caught up in a whirlwind of police interviews and sleepless nights. The local authorities seemed skeptical of my story at first. I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was just another trucker with an overactive imagination, spinning yarns to break up the monotony of the long hauls. But as they dug deeper, things started to get weird. The abandoned Chevy I'd seen at the rest stop, it had been reported stolen 3 states over, 2 days before my encounter with Jack. The owner was found dead in his home, the victim of a brutal stabbing. The overturned truck with the 2 bodies, it matched the description of a rig that had gone missing the previous week, along with its driver and his partner. The families were devastated, looking for answers that no one seemed to have. I spent hours with a police sketch artist trying to capture every detail of Jack's face. When they finally showed me the finished drawing, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was him, all right. Those cold eyes, that unkempt beard. It was like he was staring right at me from the page. The sketch was circulated to law enforcement agencies across the country. Weeks passed, then months. Leads came in, but nothing solid. Jack, if that was even his real name, seemed to have vanished into thin air. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every time I got behind the wheel, I found myself scanning the roadside, half expecting to see Jack's lanky figure emerging from the shadows. Every hitchhiker, every stranded motorist, became a potential threat in my mind. About 6 months after the incident, I was making a run through Nevada when my truck broke down. It was the middle of the night, in a stretch of desert so empty it made Idaho look like New York City. As I climbed down from the cab to check the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. I popped the hood and was leaning in, trying to figure out what was wrong, when I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. My heart started racing. I turned slowly, half expecting to see that old beat-up Chevy pulling up behind me. Instead, it was another trucker, an older guy with a white beard and a kind face. He offered to help, and together we managed to get my rig running again. As he was about to leave, he paused and gave me a long look. "You're that guy, aren't you?" he said. "The one who picked up the killer hitchhiker in Idaho?" I nodded, surprised. Word had spread through the trucking community, it seemed. The old trucker shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive, son. There are things out there on these roads, things most people wouldn't believe. You be careful, you hear?" As I watched his taillights disappear into the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the long, lonely highways of America might be hiding. A year after my encounter with Jack, I found myself sitting in a church basement in Boise, surrounded by a circle of people who looked as haunted as I felt. It was a support group for people who'd had encounters with the unexplained, the dangerous, the things that lurk in the shadows of our world. There was Mary, a waitress who swore she'd served coffee to a man who vanished into thin air when she turned her back. Tom, a forest ranger who'd seen something in the woods that he couldn't explain, something that walked on 2 legs but wasn't human. And Sarah, a young mother who'd narrowly escaped an encounter with a serial killer who'd been terrorizing her small town. As I listened to their stories, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. For the first time since that night on the highway, I didn't feel alone. These people understood what it was like to have your world turned upside down, to question everything you thought you knew about reality. When it was my turn to speak, the words came pouring out. I told them everything, about Jack, about the blood in my truck, about the bodies on the road. As I spoke, I saw recognition in their eyes. They believed me without question or hesitation. After the meeting, Sarah approached me. "Your story," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man you described, I think I've seen him." My blood ran cold. "Where?" I asked. "About a month ago. I was driving home late one night and I saw a man standing by the side of the road. Tall, thin, with a scruffy beard. He was holding something. I thought it was a knife. I didn't stop, I just drove faster." I felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief that I wasn't crazy, that Jack was real. And fear because if Sarah had seen him, it meant he was still out there somewhere. As the months turned into years, I found myself at a crossroads. The highways that had once been my home now felt alien and threatening. Every mile brought a new worry, a new potential danger. I'd lost the peace I'd once found in the solitude of long-haul driving. My kids noticed the change in me. They urged me to retire, to come stay with them and their families. "You've done enough, Dad," my daughter said during one of our weekly phone calls. "You don't have to keep pushing yourself like this." Part of me wanted to take them up on their offer, to settle down in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by family, far from the dark highways and the memories that haunted them. But another part of me, a part I didn't fully understand, knew I couldn't walk away. Not yet. There was something unfinished about my encounter with Jack, questions that needed answers, and deep down I knew that as long as he was out there, I couldn't truly rest. So I made a decision. I would keep driving, but with a purpose. I would keep my eyes open, my ears to the ground. I would talk to other truckers, share information, build a network. If Jack was still out there, still haunting the highways, I was going to find him. I didn't know what I'd do if I ever came face to face with him again, but I knew I couldn't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. One way or another, I needed closure. Over the next few years, I became something of a legend in the trucking community. The old man who'd survived an encounter with the highway killer who was still out there searching for answers. Some thought I was crazy. Others admired my determination, but most importantly, people started to talk to me. I heard stories from all over the country. A waitress in Texas who'd served a man matching Jack's description, only to find a bloody knife left behind on the table. A gas station attendant in Montana who'd had a strange encounter with a customer who asked oddly specific questions about isolated roads and police patrols. A hitchhiker in New Mexico who'd narrowly escaped being picked up by a man whose cold eyes and cruel smile had sent chills down his spine. Each story, each sighting, I marked on a map in my truck. Over time, a pattern began to emerge. Jack, or whoever he was, seemed to be moving in a rough circle through the western states, never staying in one place for long, always on the move. I shared my findings with a few trusted friends in law enforcement, but they were hesitant to act on what they saw as unreliable information. "We can't chase ghosts," one detective told me. But to me, Jack was far from a ghost. He was flesh and blood, leaving a trail of fear and violence in his wake. It was a crisp autumn night in 2008 when I had my next close encounter with Jack. I was driving through a remote part of Oregon, the kind of place where the forests crowd right up to the edge of the highway and the only light comes from your headlights and the stars above. I'd stopped at a small diner for a late dinner, one of those 24-hour places that cater almost exclusively to truckers and other night owls. As I was finishing my coffee, I overheard a conversation at the counter that made my blood run cold. "Yeah, picked him up about 50 miles back," a young trucker was saying. Skinny guy, beard, kind of intense looking, said his car broke down. I turned slowly, trying not to draw attention to myself. The trucker was talking to the waitress who was refilling his coffee cup. "Where'd you drop him?" she asked. "That's the weird thing," the trucker replied. "We got to talking, and he seemed real interested in my route. Asked if I was heading to California. When I said no, he just asked me to pull over, middle of nowhere. Said he'd wait for another ride." I didn't wait to hear more. I threw some money on the table and hurried out to my truck. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. Jack was here, close by, and he was looking for a ride to California. I spent the next few hours driving up and down that stretch of highway, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of him. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the looming trees. As dawn broke, I pulled into a rest stop, exhausted and on edge. That's when I saw it, a message carved into the wall of the bathroom stall. "Nice to see you again, Bluebird. Keep on truckin'." I stumbled out of the bathroom, my heart pounding. He'd been here, he'd seen me, and worst of all, he knew I was looking for him. For the next few months, I felt like I was losing my mind. Every shadow on the road looked like Jack. Every message on the CB radio sounded like his voice. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My kids were worried sick about me, but I couldn't explain to them what was happening. How could I tell them that I was locked in a cross-country game of cat and mouse with a killer? It all came to a head on a cold night in February 2009. I was making a run through Northern California, up near the Oregon border. The road was winding through mountains, snow piling up on the shoulders. I was tired, thinking about pulling over at the next rest stop, when my CB crackled to life. "Breaker, breaker, this is Hitchhiker. Anyone out there?" I nearly drove off the road. It was him. It was Jack. With shaking hands, I picked up the mic. "This is Bluebird," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "What's your 20, Hitchhiker?" There was a long pause, then his voice came back, low and menacing. "Why don't you pull over at the next turnout, Bluebird? I think it's time we had a chat." I knew I should keep driving, find a populated area, call the police, but a part of me knew this had to end one way or another. So when I saw the turnout, a wide spot in the road overlooking a steep drop, I pulled over. He was there, standing in the snow, just beyond the reach of my headlights. As I watched, he stepped forward into the light. It was him, all right. Older, more weathered, but unmistakably the man I'd picked up all those years ago. "Hello, James," he said as I got out of the truck. "It's been a while." "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" He smiled, a cold, empty expression that never reached his eyes. "Why does anyone do anything?" "Because I can, because it's fun. Because this whole world is just one big, empty road, and we're all just passing through." I saw the knife then, glinting in his hand. I knew I should be scared, but all I felt was a deep, overwhelming sadness. "You're wrong," I said. "The world's not empty. It's full of good people, people who help each other, people who stop for strangers on the side of the road." Something flickered in his eyes then. Doubt? Regret? I'll never know for sure. Because at that moment we heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer. Jack's head snapped around, looking back down the road. When he turned back to me, his face was a mask of fury. "You set me up," he snarled. I hadn't, of course. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. But in that moment, I saw my chance. I lunged forward, catching him off guard. We grappled in the snow, the knife between us. I felt a sharp pain in my side, but I didn't let go, and then suddenly we were falling. We'd gotten too close to the edge of the turnout, and the snow gave way beneath us. We tumbled down the steep slope over rocks and through trees, still locked together. When we finally came to a stop, I was lying on my back, looking up at the stars. Jack was a few feet away, not moving. The knife was buried in the snow between us. I don't know how long I lay there, bleeding into the snow, before the search parties found us. They told me later that another trucker had seen my rig on the turnout and called it in, worried I'd had an accident. They never found Jack's body. The spring thaw came, and the mountain streams swelled, and any trace of him was washed away. Sometimes I wonder if he survived, if he's still out there somewhere. But mostly I think he's gone. It's been 15 years since that night on the mountain. I retired from trucking not long after, finally taking my kids up on their offer to settle down. These days I spend my time playing with my grandkids, tending to my garden, and volunteering at the local community center. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I find myself thinking about those years on the road, about the long, lonely highways and the secrets they hold, about the man called Jack and all the lives he touched. I don't regret the choices I made. I did what I had to do, what I thought was right. But I can't help but wonder about the cost, the sleepless nights, the constant fear, the scars both physical and emotional. And yet for all that, I also remember the good things. The brotherhood of the open road, the kindness of strangers, the beauty of this vast, complicated country of ours, seen from behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. In the end, I guess that's what life is. A long haul through light and darkness, through joy and fear. All we can do is keep on trucking, eyes on the road ahead, always moving forward. Because you never know what's waiting around the next bend. It might be danger, it might be wonder. But whatever it is, you face it head on with courage and compassion. That's the trucker's way. That's the human way. And me, I'm James Jones, 68 years old. And this is my story. My name is David Rodriguez, and I am 78 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in the summer of 1992 when I was 46. I've kept this story to myself for over 3 decades, but now as I feel the weight of my years pressing down on me, I think it's time to share it. Maybe someone out there can make sense of what happened to me. Or maybe it'll serve as a warning to those who think they can venture into the wild places of this world without consequence. I've never been much of a storyteller, but I'll do my best to lay it out straight. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those eyes haunting me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. It was early June 1992. I'd finally saved up enough to buy a used RV, a 1985 Winnebago Chieftain. She wasn't much to look at, with her faded paint and a few dents here and there. But to me, she was freedom on wheels. I'd been working as a mechanic in Little Rock for the better part of 2 decades, and the idea of hitting the open road had been calling to me for years. I remember the day I decided to take her out for her first real spin. The air was thick with humidity, typical for Arkansas that time of year. The cicadas were singing their endless summer song, and the sun was beating down mercilessly. I'd heard about a quiet spot in the Ouachita National Forest from a buddy of mine, Joe Hawkins. Joe was an avid hunter and knew those woods like the back of his hand. "Dave," he'd said to me over beers one night, "if you want real peace and quiet, head out to Ouachita. There's a spot near Lake Ouachita off the beaten path. You won't find it on any map, but it's God's country out there." He'd given me rough directions, more of a general area than a specific location, but that was fine by me. I was looking for an adventure, a chance to unwind and disconnect from the world. Little did I know what kind of adventure I was in for. I packed up the RV with enough supplies for a week: canned goods, fishing gear, a couple of books I'd been meaning to read, and of course a cooler full of beer. I said goodbye to my neighbor, old Mrs. Thompson, and told her I'd be back in a week or so. She waved from her porch, her face etched with concern. "You be careful out there, David," she called. "Those woods can be dangerous for a city boy like you." I laughed it off at the time. Mrs. Thompson was always worrying about something or other. But looking back, I wonder if she knew something I didn't. The drive out of Little Rock was uneventful. I headed west on I-30, then south on US 70. The further I got from the city, the more relaxed I felt. The radio crackled with static, the only station I could pick up playing country songs I didn't recognize. But that was fine by me. The hum of the road and the occasional twang from the speakers were all the company I needed. As I turned onto the smaller roads leading into the Ouachita National Forest, the world seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their canopies blocking out much of the sky. The air felt different too, cooler, damper, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I rolled down the windows, letting the forest air fill the RV. It was late afternoon by the time I started looking for a place to camp. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The winding roads had become little more than dirt tracks, and I was starting to worry I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. But then, just as I was considering turning back, I saw it. A small clearing by a lake, hidden from the main road by a thick stand of trees. I carefully maneuvered the RV into the clearing, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. As I stepped out, I was struck by the silence. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets. The lake was small but beautiful, its surface like a mirror reflecting the darkening sky. "Perfect," I muttered to myself, a smile spreading across my face. This was exactly what I'd been looking for. Setting up camp was simple enough. I leveled out the RV, hooked up the battery to power the essentials, and set up a folding chair by the lake. As the last light of day faded, I cracked open a beer and sat back, feeling the tension of the week melt away. The quiet was almost unsettling at first, so different from the constant background noise of the city. But as I sat there watching the stars come out one by one, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I figured I'd stay a couple of days, do some fishing, maybe read a book or two. It was supposed to be a break from the grind, you know? A chance to recharge and come back to civilization refreshed. If only I'd known what was waiting for me in those woods. If only I'd listened to that nagging voice in the back of my mind that said something wasn't quite right. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths. And I was about to learn that sometimes the price of seeking solitude can be higher than you ever imagined. As the evening wore on, I decided to fire up the small portable grill I'd brought along. There's something primal about cooking over an open flame, especially out in the wilderness. I had some burgers in the cooler, nothing fancy, just some ground beef I'd shaped into patties before leaving home. The sizzle of the meat on the grill and the smell of it cooking should have been appetizing, but that's when I noticed something odd. There was a strange smell in the air, something that seemed out of place in the fresh forest atmosphere. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the scent of the cooking meat. But as I stood there, spatula in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The smell was wrong. It reminded me of sulfur, that rotten egg smell, but mixed with something else, something worse, like rotting meat, but not quite. I wrinkled my nose, looking around the clearing. The lake was calm, reflecting the last remnants of twilight. The trees stood silent sentinels at the edge of the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place but that smell. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Maybe it was just some stagnant water nearby, or some decaying vegetation. That had to be it. But even as I tried to rationalize it, a part of me knew better. In all my years of camping and hunting, I'd never smelled anything quite like this. It was alien, out of place, and it set my teeth on edge. I finished cooking the burgers, but found my appetite had waned. I managed to eat one, washing it down with another beer, but the second patty went uneaten. As I cleaned up, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching me from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the encroaching darkness and that persistent, unsettling smell. Night fell quickly, as it often does in the forest. The clearing was plunged into an inky blackness that seemed to swallow up the beam of my flashlight. The stars, at least, were brilliant. Without the light pollution of the city, the Milky Way stretched across the sky in a dazzling display. Under different circumstances, I would have sat out for hours, just stargazing. But that night, I felt an urge to be inside, behind locked doors. I secured everything outside, making sure the grill was completely out and storing the cooler in the RV's small exterior compartment. As I did my final check, I noticed the smell had faded. Maybe I had imagined it after all. Maybe it was just my city senses adjusting to the unfamiliar forest scents. Inside the RV, things felt more normal. The space was cozy, if a bit cramped. I had a small table that doubled as a workspace, a surprisingly comfortable bed, and a kitchenette that was more functional than fancy. I'd brought along a few books, some Louis L'Amour westerns and a Stephen King novel I'd been meaning to get around to. I settled in with one of the L'Amour books, reading by the dim light of a battery-powered lantern. But I couldn't focus on the words. My mind kept drifting back to that smell, to the feeling of being watched. I found myself straining to hear any sound from outside, but there was nothing except the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Eventually, fatigue began to set in. The drive, the fresh air, and the beers had taken their toll. I marked my place in the book and got ready for bed. As I lay there in the darkness, I could hear the wind picking up, whistling through the trees. It was a lonely sound, reminding me of just how isolated I was out here. My last conscious thought before drifting off was a note to myself to check the RV's propane lines in the morning. Maybe that was the source of the sulfur smell. It was a comforting thought, a rational explanation that allowed me to finally relax and let sleep take me. If only I'd stayed awake a little longer, if only I'd been more alert, maybe I would have heard it coming. Maybe I would have had a chance to leave before things went so terribly wrong. But I slept, unaware that something out there in the darkness had taken notice of me, and it was getting closer. I'm not sure how long I slept, but I woke with a start, my heart pounding. For a moment I was disoriented, forgetting where I was. The inside of the RV was pitch black and the silence was absolute. Then I heard it, the sound that must have woken me. It was a scratching noise coming from outside. At first I thought it might be a branch scraping against the side of the RV, but as I listened I realized it was too regular, too deliberate. It sounded like nails on metal, a slow, methodical scratching that sent shivers down my spine. My first rational thought was raccoons. They can be pretty bold, and I wouldn't have been surprised to find them trying to get into the cooler. But even as I had the thought, I knew it wasn't right. The sound was too loud, too powerful to be made by something as small as a raccoon. I lay there in the darkness, barely breathing, just listening. The scratching continued, moving slowly along the side of the RV. Whatever was making the noise was big. My mind, still foggy with sleep, conjured images of bears, mountain lions, impossible monsters with claws like knives. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just lie there and wait for whatever it was to find its way inside. Moving as quietly as I could, I reached for the flashlight I'd left on the small bedside table. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The scratching stopped abruptly. Had it heard me move? I held my breath, straining my ears. The silence stretched on, broken only by the pounding of my heart, so loud I was sure it must be audible outside. Then I heard something else, a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and it filled me with a primal, instinctive fear. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I knew I had to look. I had to see what was out there. With a trembling hand, I reached for the curtain covering the small window near my bed. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers on the fabric. Did I really want to see what was making those sounds? What if it saw me? The decision was made for me when something heavy slammed against the side of the RV, rocking it on its wheels. I let out an involuntary yelp, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. In one motion, I yanked back the curtain and clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing. For a split second, I saw something, a shape, dark and massive, moving with impossible speed at the edge of the light. Then it was gone, vanishing into the tree line so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. I sat there, flashlight trained on the spot where I'd seen the shape, for what felt like hours. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It had been big, that much I was sure of. Bigger than a bear and shaped all wrong, but beyond that I couldn't say. It had moved so fast, been there and gone in the blink of an eye. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I became aware of other things. The smell was back, stronger than ever. That sulfurous, rotting odor seemed to permeate everything. And there was something else, a sense of wrongness in the air, as if reality itself had been warped by whatever had visited in the night. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up, flashlight in one hand and my hunting knife in the other, watching the windows and listening for any sound of the thing's return. But there was nothing. Just the quiet of the forest and that lingering, awful smell. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. Whatever had been out there seemed to have gone. But I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be staying another night in this clearing. As soon as it was fully light, I was going to pack up and move on. Maybe find a campground with other people around. Or maybe just head back to civilization altogether. Little did I know, my encounter in the night was just the beginning. The true terror was yet to come. The sun rose slowly, as if it too was hesitant to shed light on whatever had transpired during the night. As soon as it was bright enough to see clearly, I cautiously stepped out of the RV, my knife clutched tightly in my hand. The morning was crisp and cool, a light mist hanging over the lake. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. But all I could focus on were the marks on the side of the RV. They were unmistakable, 4 long, parallel gouges running along the metal siding. They started about halfway up and ran almost to the ground. Whatever had made them had some serious claws. I ran my fingers along the marks, feeling the depth of them. These weren't just surface scratches. The metal was deeply scored. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized how close the thing had been. Only a thin metal wall had separated me from whatever had made these marks, and judging by the height of the scratches, it had been big, much bigger than I'd initially thought. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a bear. A big one, sure, but still just a bear. They were known to roam these parts after all. But even as I had the thought, I knew it wasn't true. Bears didn't move the way that thing had moved. They didn't disappear into the night like a shadow, and they certainly didn't leave behind that god-awful smell, which I noticed was still lingering in the air. I did a quick circuit of the clearing, looking for tracks or any other signs of what had visited in the night. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt and pine needles, not great for leaving prints. But near the edge of the clearing, where the ground was a bit softer, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. But not like any animal prints I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot. And they weren't shaped like a bear's paw or any other creature I could think of. They were almost human-like, but elongated and with what looked like claw marks at the tips. I stared at the prints, trying to make sense of them. What kind of creature could have left these? My mind flashed back to stories I'd heard as a kid, tales of Bigfoot and other mysterious beasts said to roam the wilderness. But this seemed like something else entirely. As I stood there lost in thought, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing there, just the trees, their branches moving slightly in the morning breeze. That was enough for me. Whatever was out here, whatever had visited in the night, I wanted no part of it. I practically ran back to the RV, my earlier bravado completely forgotten. I had to get out of here. I packed up as quickly as I could, throwing my gear haphazardly into the RV. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. My only thought was putting as much distance between myself and this clearing as possible. As I was about to start the engine, I took one last look around. The forest seemed different now, darker somehow, despite the morning sunlight. I could have sworn I saw movement in the tree line, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. I gunned the engine and pulled out of the clearing, tires spinning on the loose dirt. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing after the RV, but the road behind me remained empty. I drove nonstop for several hours, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I didn't have a clear destination in mind. I just knew I needed to put distance between myself and whatever I'd encountered in that clearing. The forest gradually thinned out, giving way to more open country. When I finally saw signs for a small town called Mina, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The normality of the place, the hum of the refrigerators, the ding of the bell as customers came and went, was almost shocking after the otherworldly experience of the night before. I went inside to pay for gas and grab a much-needed coffee. The attendant, an older guy with a grizzled beard and a name tag that read Earl, took one look at my pale face and wild eyes and asked if I was all right. I hesitated for a moment. How could I possibly explain what had happened? But something in Earl's expression, a mixture of concern and knowing, made me open up. I told him about the footprints, the smell, the eyes I'd seen in the darkness. As I spoke, Earl's expression grew more serious. When I finished, he nodded slowly, as if he'd heard it all before. "Sounds like you met the Kushtaka," he said, his voice low and serious. "The what?" I asked, confused. "Kushtaka," Earl repeated. "Old folks around here have stories about it. They say it's a shapeshifter, a creature that can take on human form but isn't human at all. They're drawn to the scent of fear and loneliness." I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just a local legend. But something about Earl's tone, the way his eyes looked right through me, made me uneasy. "Listen, son," Earl said, leaning in close. "Whatever you do, don't go back into those woods alone. The Kushtaka, they say it likes to lure people deeper into the forest. And those that follow, well, they don't come back." I thanked Earl for the warning, paid for my gas, and hurried back to the RV. As I pulled out of the gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd had a narrow escape. But at least I was out of those woods now. I decided to head straight back to Little Rock, back to the safety of civilization. The drive back to Little Rock was uneventful, but I couldn't relax. Every shadow on the road seemed to move. Every dark patch of forest along the highway seemed to hide watching eyes. I kept the radio on loud, tuned to a talk station, just to have some human voices to keep me company. It was late afternoon by the time I pulled into my driveway. Mrs. Thompson was out on her porch again, and she waved as I parked the RV. I waved back, managing a weak smile. How could I explain that her warning had been more accurate than either of us could have imagined? That night, safe in my own bed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I'd eaten some bad food, or the isolation had played tricks on my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those inhuman eyes staring back at me from the darkness. It's been over 3 decades since that night in the Ouachita National Forest, but I've never forgotten it. I've never gone back to those woods, and I've never camped alone again. The RV sat in my driveway for years, the scratches on its side a constant reminder of what I'd encountered. I sold it eventually, but I never told the buyer about its history. Some nights when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still smell that sickly sulfurous odor. In my dreams, I'm back in that clearing, and something is circling the RV, scratching, trying to get in. I don't know what I saw out there. Maybe it was the kushtaka that Earl talked about, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the dark places where humans rarely go. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I was lucky to escape. Whatever was out there, it let me go. Or maybe it's just biding its time, waiting for me to let my guard down. So if you're ever in the Ouachita National Forest and you find a secluded spot that seems too perfect, think twice before you set up camp. And if you smell something strange on the night air, something like sulfur and rotting meat, don't ignore it like I did. Pack up and leave. Drive until you hit civilization. And whatever you do, don't look back. Because something is out there in those woods, and it's hungry. I grew up exploring the woods. There's several dozen acres behind the home I grew up in. I've been through them so many times. I know just about every single tree, every hill, and every stream. There's some adjacent cow pastures around them, and several clearings. Now that I'm older, I don't go into them quite as much, but I still go for a walk through them a couple of times throughout the year. A few weeks ago, I went for a walk through the woods. I'm just walking alone when I come across an old discarded refrigerator. It's down in a fairly deep ditch. It almost looks like a sinkhole, and I've seen it before, I'm sure. The refrigerator, however, was new to me. The most intriguing part was that it was there at all. I knew exactly where in the woods I was. There's a familiar clearing that you pass through to get to it, and it was about another 25 yards into the trees. There's no footpath or trail to it. There's certainly no trails for a vehicle to get to this particular spot. Even the clearing itself is tree-locked with no big trails. Whoever put this old kitchen appliance here hoofed it in a hard way. I was sure of it. It was an older-looking refrigerator. I would guess from the 80s, maybe the early 90s. It looked like it had been there for a little while. It was extremely dirty and still had the remnants of dead leaves from the previous fall on top of it. It was laying face down, putting the weight of the thing on the door. I was pretty curious about it. I stumbled/slid down into the ditch to get a closer look. I walked around it, inspected it, poked at it. It's just so weird to find an old fridge in the middle of the woods in my mind. I tried to push it over to open it, but I couldn't even budge it. This thing was sturdy, and it was heavy as all get out. It made the idea of getting it out here in the first place even more perplexing. I'm not sure what I was expecting to happen when I knocked on it. Maybe Indiana Jones would pop out. But I gave it 2 sharp knocks on the side. After half a moment, it knocked back. 2 loud, sharp knocks rang back out from the fridge. It was certainly startling enough to throw me back onto my 4th point of contact. I stared at the fridge for a moment before I got up and scrambled back up out of the ditch. I was pretty inert, so I quickly began the long walk back home. I was pretty paranoid the entire hike back, looking over my shoulder, jumping at every single little noise, of which there are an abundance of in the woods. Once I was back to my house, I began hypothesizing on it. There absolutely couldn't be anything inside of it. I reasoned that the most likely scenario was that when I was pushing on it, I had dislodged something inside of it, and that something came loose and fell and made the noise inside of the fridge. That sounded good to me. Last week, I decided to go back. I planned on taking the camera with me, but as my camera was my phone, and my phone had recently had a losing fight with the washing machine, I decided to take my parents' old film camera. The roll of film I had was pretty old, but I hoped it would work well enough. In retrospect, I wished I had waited until I got a new phone, or at least gotten a new roll of film. So I went back. After 20 minutes of crunching my way through the woods, I came to the familiar clearing. Just on the other side, I would be coming up to the ditch with the refrigerator. As I crossed the clearing, though, there was a dead cow. This isn't entirely uncommon. Cows from the adjacent pastures have made it through a hole in the barbed wire fences and wandered into the woods pretty regularly for as long as I can remember. I've come across my fair share of bones and carcasses in the past. All the same, I still went to inspect the cow. It wasn't too decomposed. Sure, there were plenty of flies and maggots, but it's summer and it's hot. Something had definitely been eating on it, though. There was some pretty obvious chewing that had happened. I chalked it up to coyotes. They've always been in the area, as evident by their occasional howling at night. Nothing struck me as particularly strange. All the same, I had 27 shots on my roll of film to use up, so I took a couple of pictures. I turned and surveyed the rest of the clearing when something else caught my eye. There was a group of stones set up on a far edge of the pasture. This struck me as being strange, because these stones were pretty large, clean, and white. Not usually the kind of stone I'm used to seeing out in the woods. As I got closer, I saw that they were set up in a small formation in front of a pile of brush. The brush was forming a small roof over some kind of a burrow. I snapped some pictures and got closer and could see that the small entrance went down into the dirt with no bottom quite in sight. I didn't know what kind of animal could be living in there, so I didn't get much closer. I backed off and decided that I had seen enough of the clearing and continued on to go document the refrigerator. I walked into the woods and headed towards the ditch. I wasn't really expecting what came next. When I got to the edge of the ditch and looked at the old refrigerator, I froze. The fridge had moved. It was now rolled onto its side, and the door was hanging open. It was completely empty, save for some dirt and leaves. Something had come and rolled this thing on its side and opened it up. I took a few pictures and retreated. Between the knocking sounds a couple of weeks ago and it being open now, I was feeling a bit of paranoia. So I began walking back home. A few steps away from the edge of the ditch, I caught a flash of yellow on the ground out of the corner of my eye. I looked over to see a spent shotgun shell laying in the undergrowth. I took the couple of steps to investigate and picked it up. I reasoned with myself that it was just one of the locals deep out in the woods squirrel hunting. I dropped it and began walking home again. The rest of my walk was spent in a pretty high state of paranoia. I didn't stop at the pasture to look at the dead cow again. I went straight through and was nearly halfway back to my house. I was looking over my shoulder investigating one of those small sounds that are always present in the woods when I kicked something. It tumbled through the leaves and brush a few feet. When I snapped my head forward to see what I had kicked, it was just a plain, black boot. I thought to myself how strange it was for there to be a deserted boot out here in the woods. No stranger than a refrigerator, I suppose. The leather was weathered and well used. It had big blotches of something dark brown on it was cracking and peeling off. I pondered about when the last time it had rained had been, when suddenly there was a loud crash in the woods behind me. I didn't even try to look behind me. I was already on edge at this point and took off running in the direction I knew was my house. Another loud crash sounded behind me, giving me an extra burst in speed. I was smacked in the face by leaves and tree limbs, and almost tripped after getting caught on a thorny vine. When I finally broke through the tree line into my backyard, a bit battered and torn up, I ran straight through the back door and locked it behind me. It took a while to calm down. It was just a weird day, all the way around. The next day, I dropped off the roll of film at Walgreens while I was out running errands and picked up the pictures on the way home. I was pretty disappointed because the film was aged terribly and only 2 pictures came out. None of the cow, none of the refrigerator. I had one random picture of trees that I don't remember specifically taking, and one of the rock formation in front of the burrow in the clearing. Either way, I think that's the last time I'm going to go into the woods. At least for a good, long while. Or until I can get my hands on a gun. I wasn't really planning on writing this all up. I thought it would be a fun story with a lot of strange coincidences to tell while drinking. But I found out a few days ago that one of our neighbors on an adjacent street hasn't been home in a couple of weeks. They haven't searched for him too much. They think he ran off with another woman, because he was that kind of guy, but I know that he likes to hunt. 2 days ago, my dog disappeared. My dog only goes outside to use the bathroom and run around the yard for a bit. She never goes into the woods, and she's never outside for more than an hour. But now she's gone. Yesterday, I went to the edge of the woods to call for her since she had been gone for over a day. I found her collar hanging in a piece of brush. I think there's something new living in my woods, and I think it followed me home. It was getting near Halloween and me and my body wanted to scare our girlfriends and or find a good make-out spot in the woods. We were seniors in high school and all still lived at home, so we had to find out-of-the-way spots to smooch. My buddy said he found the perfect place, but we needed bolt cutters. My dad had some, so that Friday night I swiped them from our garage on the floor of a setup for Old Hagman's Road. No one lived off of that old dirt road, which ran through the woods connecting 2 other roads. These roads themselves didn't get much traffic, but Old Hagman's Road got none at all because it was blocked off on both ends by fence-style gates which were locked with chains and padlocks. Right on the gates were warning signs that read, "Do not enter by order of the Howard County Sheriff's Office." We pulled up to the south entrance and my friend got out and cut the chain with the bolt cutters and opened the gate. I drove the car and passed the gate, which he shut behind us. He got back in the car and told us all that they closed the road off about 20 years earlier, but no one knows why. He said there were rumors that people had died back there and even the cops won't drive down it. The road itself had gotten bumpy over the years with dips and occasional branches lying across its width. My headlight shone up ahead only about 40 to 50 feet, revealing the autumn-colored leaves on branches overhanging the path mixed in with some evergreens. The darkness outside of the cone of light cast from the car was deep and foreboding, and the woods were thick and cluttered with vines, bushes, and various brush, all casting twisted black shadows onto the trees and litter behind them. The girls held our arms and cuddled closer, mildly intimidated by the spooky setting. At one point on a straight section of the road, I briefly turned up the headlights for a laugh. The girls howled almost in unison for me to turn them back on. Me and my bud chuckled out loud and I promised not to turn them off again. I drove at a steady 10 miles per hour only because the bumps were too serious to comfortably handle any faster. I rounded a corner to the left when we all saw 2 red lights up ahead. They seemed like they were reflecting the headlights of my car rather than being self-illuminating. I stopped to get a better look before going on. Was this the eyeshine of some animal? They seemed too far apart for that. I proceeded cautiously. When we got about 50 feet from the lights, the body of the thing the lights were attached to faded into view from the thick darkness behind. It was an old car. The rear reflectors were the source of the red lights we saw. It was a dark blue sedan with its paint chipping off, a good bit of rust, and lots of leaves on its trunk and roof. The rear window was covered in dust, and as I steered to the left side of the road to go around it, We could see that so were the windows to the doors. But we all noticed that the driver's window was down about halfway. I slowed down a little as I creeped past the abandoned car. Looking over, the interior couldn't be seen through the dust-caked windows. As the inside of the driver's seat came into view through its half-open window, a sense of dread and anticipation swept through us all. The steering wheel was in view when my body spoke up to assure everyone not to worry. They wouldn't close the road without getting everybody out of here first. They were comforting words, and of course, he was right. No need to worry. But as the headrest of the driver's seat came into view, we all stared at it anyway, transfixed and tight with suspense. The dust on the window prevented us from being able to see through it clearly, so all we could make out was a sliver of the interior. At first glance, it seemed the seat was empty. But then I noticed just above the top of the partially rolled down window you could see something on the backrest of the seat. It looked like dark hair on the top of someone's head who had slid down in the seat. But it was just an inch or so, and it was dark, so it could have been something else. One of the girls asked if that was a person. No one answered her because we weren't sure. I had come to a complete stop so we could look at it a little longer and try to figure it out. Out of habit, I glanced in my driver's side rearview mirror and noted the dim red glow of my brake lights on the brush to the side of the road and on the dirt. But something was off. I could see a dark bulge to the side of the car. It was protruding outward from the rear bumper. It seemed to be right up against the car, but it was too dark to make out any details. Then it moved. There was someone there. Crouching. I looked with more focus to try to make out what it was when the brake lights revealed an opening mouth and the appearance of a set of teeth and long canine fangs. My heart started racing and hands trembling. I started to move forward to get past the car, saying nothing so as not to alarm the others. I kept one foot on the brake to keep the brake lights on as I watched it in the mirror. As I pulled forwards, it stood up. Its body was wide and thick. It stood on two legs and was humanoid in its basic structure. It had large hands with thick claws at the end of each finger. It was covered in hair except for its chest, which was reminiscent of a gorilla's chest. Its head was exactly like the head of a bison, only with thick fangs and an angry grimace on its face. It even had horns. It stood there as I drove off. No one else had seen it. With a wavering voice, I asked my body to have the bolt cutters ready. I said we needed to get out of there fast. He suggested we turn around, but I informed him that there wasn't room on the road for that and I wasn't going back that way no matter what. I increased my speed and held it there even though the bumps were making the passengers angry. My body could tell something was wrong. He asked me if I saw something else besides the possible man in the car. I replied only to tell him to have the bolt cutters ready and to work as fast as he could when we got to the north gate. Up ahead there was a small opening in the trees to the left, and as we passed it, a dark figure on all fours ran towards the car from the clearing. It slammed into the driver's side door hard, making a loud boom and pushing the car sideways about a half a foot. The girl screamed. I put the pedal to the floor. I checked the rear view and the thing was on all fours sideways in the road. It looked up towards us and then gave chase. As we sped along the road, we passed an old police car off to the right in a ditch. The driver's side door was open and several of its windows were broken. Around the next bend in the road there was an old station wagon. The windows were all broken on this one and it was positioned sideways across the road, almost blocking our way. Inside we could see the decayed remains of a family. Mom and Dad in the front seat with skeletal smiles and two teenage kids in the back, both rotted and mummified. The girls were in full freak-out mode and my buddy was now holding the bolt cutters up as if to use them as a weapon if need be. I was banging over the bumps and the beast was pounding on the trunk as it tried to catch up. We had the gate in sight when I realized that this wasn't going to work. It would be upon us by the time my body could get the chain cut. There were no other side roads and not enough room to turn around. The gate was far too sturdy to bust through with the car. When I stopped, it was going to break a window and at least one of us was going to die. There was no way around that now. I had to make a choice. A choice I hope none of you will ever have to make. A choice I have to live with for the rest of my life. Later, a man in a black suit would show up at the sheriff's office and I'd be released. No sign of my having been arrested could be found in the public record. I had to sign a paper preventing me from talking about what happened for the rest of my life or face a 10-year prison sentence and a $10,000 fine. My father received a new car as a gift from an anonymous stranger. The parents of the other 3 passengers who were with me also received anonymous compensation. But even now, years later, I still wake up in a cold sweat at night. I can still hear their screams. I can still see their faces staring at me in horror and disbelief as the beast pulled the girls out of the car, tore them with its claws, and bit into their necks. I can still see the blood on the window of my open driver's side door. I can still see that horn thrusting out of my body's chest at the gate as he dropped the bolt cutters and I climbed down the other side to safety. And I still have to admit to myself that even though I carry a ton of guilt and shame for leaving them to die, I still have to admit that if I got a do-over, I'd do the same thing all over again. And if you saw what I saw, you would too.